What does it take to make workshops work? And how can we facilitate collaboration that sticks and leads to results? My name is Miriam Hartness, and with the Workshops Work podcast, I am on the mission to find the magic ingredients that make workshops work. Today with me on the show is Marie Dubost, and we speak about accessibility in online workshops and how can we make sure that the sessions we are designing are accessible for everyone to attend. So stay tuned. And by the way, if you don't have pen and paper at hand to take your own notes, scroll down to the show notes to download my free one-page summary. And now, lean back and be ready to be inspired. Hello, Marie.
Hey.
Welcome to the show.
Thank you.
I am looking forward to our conversation and would like to introduce just with a little anecdote that sometimes we encounter each other so many times, and I knew that you were a brilliant facilitator and community member. And then by pure coincidence, I learned that you're an expert in accessibility and inclusion, and listening to you, it just blew my mind. And I thought, okay, more people need to know about that. So I'm very grateful to have you on the show today.
Thank you. I'm so glad to be able to share more about this with the facilitation community.
Yes, I'm sure that I am not the only one being partly ignorant on many of these topics. And before we're getting there, always start with the same question. When did you start calling yourself a facilitator? Assuming that you do.
I do. I don't call myself an expert. I don't like this word, but I do call myself a facilitator. I think I started in 2019 to call myself a facilitator. I trained in 2016, but it took me a bit of time to build the confidence and the assurance that I was getting better at developing fully fledged sessions and workshops that were effective. And so I only started calling myself that in 2019.
Was there a specific moment or instance that you suddenly thought, oh, I got that?
Yeah, I think definitely in 2020, there was really this realization that the online environment was really like, I was like a fish in the, a fish in the ocean. All of a sudden, I was like, I can thrive in this. I was reflecting about this for a number of reasons because I have a hearing loss. And so the thing is, when I'm online and I have my headphones and everything, I can hear everything that's going on. I never have to worry about like some background noise and like having to strain and read people's lips. And so this is actually making it a lot easier for me. And people are saying like, oh, you're really good at this. You should do more on this. And I was realizing like, oh, wow. So I can do this. Yeah, like this could become my full-time job. And so it did.
Oh, wonderful. And was inclusion already a topic that you were aware of then in the physical space? Because that's what I understand you sharing about your hearing problems, that you might have had more awareness on how to include others.
Sure. Well, before I started learning about facilitation and calling myself facilitator, I was also a program manager for almost 7 years in an organization that worked with service providers to people with disabilities. And I was also a manager. I hired, employed, and trained people with disabilities. So I worked alongside disability activists and people who work in that space. So I was already very aware of this. And oftentimes I had to organize events. And then, you go to the hotel or the place that assured you, we swear, yes, we're definitely accessible. And then you show up and you realize there's like a couple of flights of stairs leading to the accessible bathroom, or the bathroom is locked because it's actually being used as a storage space for like cleaning supplies or whatever. And then you become keenly aware that accessibility is really an issue because oftentimes people don't always know what is going to make a space inaccessible. And they may call something accessible that is not really. And so I realized that it's not easy for everyone to know what they're doing in this space. Mm-hmm. So yes, to answer more quickly your question, yes, I was aware of these kinds of things from personal experience and from working around people with disabilities. And I was keenly aware that already in the physical space, this was an issue. But I also wanted to more recently start really studying and, delving really deep into what makes online sessions accessible as well.
Yeah. And I loved your example that of the physical space. Yes, it's totally accessible. And then there are still the 3 steps leading to the so accessible bathrooms. And I can only imagine that it has to do with our biased awareness. So if it doesn't affect me, I don't pay attention. And then I don't even realize these 3 steps because my brain doesn't notice them. And only if I am either trained to pay attention or I'm in a wheelchair, for instance, myself, then I will surely notice. And I can imagine that this is only one of the very obvious accessibility issues. Mm-hmm. And then when it comes to the online space, there are so many hidden traps. Mm-hmm. Because, and maybe that's a good way to start the conversation, is when we speak about accessibility, what does it actually include and exclude?
Sure. So when we talk about online accessibility, we're thinking about sort of like 5 to 6 groups of people. We're thinking about people with visual disabilities. So that could be people who are blind, people who have vision loss, people who may not be able to perceive like all kinds of contrast. It could also be people who are colorblind. So whose perception of color is different from that of a non-colorblind person. We have people who are deaf or hard of hearing. I don't always include myself in that last group because I'm not like, I feel like I'm not sufficiently like, impaired, let's say, to call myself that, but I am conscious that it does sometimes inconvenience me. And then we also have people with sometimes physical conditions, like, for example, if you have tremors in your hand, you might have some difficulty using a mouse all the time. So then you would use a keyboard or maybe some other form of device that allows you to control the screen, what's happening on the screen. And then you have people who are neurodivergent, so people with ADHD, on the autism spectrum disorder, people with cognitive impairments, and people with mental health issues. So these are kind of like the groups we're looking at. And we're looking at people who, for example, people with cognitive impairments may have difficulty remembering things or may find it easier when information is presented in a particular way, synthesized in a particular way. We're also including people with something called it's called a learning difficulty, dyslexia. It's actually fairly common. It's a lot more common than we think. And it's also about like the way the text is presented and how it's there are like best practices for presenting information on screen so that it can be perceived by people. So this is kind of like what we're looking at. If you're curious about the numbers, I think there might have been an intention about the question about the numbers, like what size group are we talking about? There's all kinds of different studies in the US, in Europe, in the UK, and I don't always have like the clearest picture, but the European Disability Forum here in Europe, they estimate that about 20% of the population has some disability of some kind. They may not necessarily it's a lot. They may not necessarily call themselves disabled because sometimes it could be like someone, over the age of, 80 or 90 has, decreased vision or decreased mobility. They may not necessarily name themselves this way. They may not necessarily be recognized as such by their government because, they have an access need, but it may be not, like in my case, it's not high enough that you would like get some sort of pass or card or, something that you can carry around to explain what you have. And for online users, we're estimating about 10 to 15% of internet users have some sort of access need.
It's big.
Yeah, it's really big. Now, obviously, for some facilitators, maybe I have to mention that your mileage may vary. If you only facilitate sessions with people between the ages of, I don't know, like 20 and 55, maybe, the percentage you would meet on a day-to-day may be smaller than that. But I mean, it is a numerical minority, but it's not like that small that
we can ignore it.
Exactly. That's my suggestion.
Yeah. And I wonder, how do we know? And I remember in our exploration call, you mentioned, and I felt so seen because I'm definitely part of it. Oh, I think, but in my session, people, they can access, or it's not so relevant because it's such a small group, or it's only the community. And then I realized that I actually never asked the question and I wouldn't even know how to assess. So how do you prepare? What is the minimum that everyone by now has to fulfill just to make sure that we are not excluding anyone? And then how do we know whether we have to adjust even further? Can we just ask the question? Because I don't want to put anyone on the spotlight.
No, I think you raise a good point, which is that, for example, some disabilities are not visible, and some of them are kind of conditional. For example, my hearing loss does not inconvenience me online because I can control exactly what amount of sound comes to my ears, and it comes also very clearly. But if I'm in a very busy room and there's a lot of chatter, or if I'm following a presentation and I can only find a seat at the back of the room and there's people in front of me like, there I have an issue, see? So it can be conditional. It doesn't always show up in the same ways. But I have some sort of like tips or like some basic, somewhat easy sort of suggestions to make to sort of like accommodate, let's say the biggest groups. So, to cover the most. For example, although neurodivergence and cognitive impairments and mental health are, they're not the same thing. But a lot of the measures that you would, for example, proactively take to make these groups more comfortable actually are fairly similar, which is to do with providing very clear information in advance about your session, about where it's going to be hosted, about how long it is, about the agenda. Are there going to be breakout rooms? How are people, are people going to be expected to like turn on their camera and their microphone at some point? Is it like essentially, how can I participate? How can I show up to your session? How many breakouts will there be? This can really be helpful for people who have anxiety or just generally people who find it useful to know exactly what is going to be expected of them so that they can know that, for example, if they're having a, terrible, horrible, no good, very bad day, and this is a highly interactive session, then maybe they know that they can sit this one out, or this one, actually, it's okay to participate at a lower level because there will be possibilities to, to like sit out breakout discussions, for example. Would be like one way. Yeah, go ahead.
And I would love to dive a little bit deeper before you get to the next group, because I think this is very interesting in the framework or the context of the conversation of how much of our session do we disclose and how much can we actually plan ahead of our session, assuming or knowing that lots of things have to change once we enter the room. So maybe if we're hosting an open general workshop, a personal growth workshop, we pretty much can follow the agenda. But when it comes to a team workshop or we are hosting something for a client, then very often we have our agenda, we have our plan. And the moment we arrive, we realize that the group actually needs something else. So where can we find the balance between disclosing what will happen in advance and still having the ability to change it? And maybe even going a step further, avoiding micromanagers to say, oh, I saw your agenda. May I suggest something different? Which is the facilitator's nightmare, right?
Yeah, don't we just love it when the client suddenly jumps in and says, actually, this needs less discussion time. No, I see what you mean. And I also understand that I know a lot of facilitators who are really great at facilitating sessions where it's very experiential and you show up and all you have is just a sense of like the kind of session it's going to be, but you have zero agenda and you're kind of like going into the unknown, which can also be very nice because also as a facilitator, you do reduce overwhelm when you don't divulge too much in advance so that people don't start to already anticipate the next step, which sometimes our brain are just like, we just want to anticipate the next step. Some people do like to have clarity on the whole process. I think there you want to figure out, maybe it's not about sharing the entire agenda, but it would be helpful to let people know if in this, 120-minute session, will there be a break somewhere in there so that people can take care of their bio needs or just decompress, what kind of interaction level would be expected. So you may not have to disclose the whole agenda, but you could still give people some indication of what is the way to show up in this particular session. Do I have to prepare something in advance? Do I just show up and experience it? All the while knowing that there might be still some moments in which we have breakouts, but we don't know when exactly or how many or what they will contain. If the agenda has to change, mid-session because, you find out that, this is not what the group needs in this moment, you can explain this and say, look, I know we talked about the possibility of having this other kind of session, but I see that we're going to make a slight adjustment. And, is that okay for everybody? And then at least it gives people a chance to, just like when you think you're going to go like 5 or 10 minutes over time, and you ask for the permission of the people, while at the same time leaving people with the option of potentially, leaving if they do have to leave at the time. You can also potentially, without having to divulge too much about the process of the facilitator and these like on the moment adjustments, just kind of give people a heads up that there's a slight change from what they had sort of been like mentally, prepared. To show up to.
And that's true. And I think even if we don't disclose the agenda, or even if we don't know the agenda, I think we have a pretty good understanding of what type of facilitators we are. So for instance, I know whatever session I host, there will be breakouts. We usually start with a one-on-one breakout, and there will be a lot of kind of small group conversations. So no matter what we're going to discuss, it might then be helpful, if I understand you correctly, to just highlight this in advance to say, okay, it's highly interactive. There will be small group breakouts. And if you're not comfortable with that, the session might not be for you.
Right. Or maybe let people rename themselves in Zoom with like a little icon or something before their name. And you create a breakout room of people who just chill and do whatever.
I want to be in a breakout room.
I've seen this done recently. And it was very well done. So you could put your like a name or a number before your name and so on. And then there was a group of people who were just chilling with some music and just doing something else while the rest of us were having small group conversations.
It's as if you anticipated my next question, because I recently had a quite almost emotional discussion with fellow facilitators on the design of a large group workshop, and exactly around this question. What happens if participants don't want to be in breakout rooms? And it was interesting, and I would be curious about your perception or thoughts, because I think there's a difference between preferences and conditions. So there might be participants who have a preference not to be in breakouts because I cannot be bothered with other people and having these woo-woo, kumbaya, vulnerable conversations. I just don't want to deal with that. This can be a preference. And then there's a condition. If I am in a one-on-one breakout with another room, I get anxiety, or I feel stressed, or I feel overwhelmed. So for me, these are two very different things. And how do we accommodate for that? Do we ask people to put themselves out there, in air quotes, by renaming themselves? Or do we make it too easy for them, although sometimes getting slightly out of your comfort zone, thinking that it's a preference and not a condition, is actually beneficial, and that's our job? So how do we deal with that?
Yeah, and these are never like, like I said, there's best practices, and then there's, and maybe if you ask me again in 3 years from now, maybe I will have a different answer even to this question.
Absolutely fine.
Probably my thinking will have evolved. I think it's about, if you think it's possible for a few people to sit out the session and it's not going to endanger the quality or the design of the session, if a few people sit out the breakout room, then you could say, if for you it's really not convenient right now to do a breakout room, or you would really prefer not to, please, put this emoji or this letter before your name in Zoom. And then in the way you phrase it, of course, you won't know if the person absolutely needs it or it's just a preference. You won't be able to investigate. And that's also the thing. When you provide accessibility accommodations, you provide them without asking people to justify why they are accessing them. And you just trust that, everybody's an adult here. And if somebody doesn't want to engage, not because they can't, but because they just don't feel like it, well, I mean, it's too bad. I guess the way you phrase the invitation to sit it out, maybe you can try to say, depending on the tone you use, you can say like, okay, if it's really inconvenient for you, feel free to put this before your name. But, we really hope to have a lot of contributions on this topic because we're harvesting a lot of, insights and ideas. So if you want to contribute to these ideas, please place yourself in a group or whatever it may be. But I think the invitation also should be extended in a way that is non-judgmental, all the while knowing that some people will access it with completely valid reasons, and some people will, maybe not fall in the category of the people you thought about when you designed it. But, well, that's kind of what happens. I was hearing something the other day about, and this is some part of the checklist I was doing for venues to be accessible. Sometimes we have like these like no cell phone rules, like in some yoga space or some meetings and so on. But some people use their cell phones as an extension of a medical device, like, for example, a glucose
Diabetes
monitor, or, it connects to the hearing aids and stuff like this. And so if you put a no phones allowed policy, but you don't put an exception saying, but of course, if you're using it for medical reasons, definitely keep it, or something to that effect, you can create a situation where somebody is using their phone because they genuinely need to have it on them. And then, there can be a thing where people feel like they have to justify it. And the thing of having to justify why you're accessing an exception can feel, it's just definitely does not feel nice.
Doesn't feel safe, yeah.
But it's even like, it's something I hadn't even thought about this, because I may be the person who's obsessed with accessibility, but even I don't know everything, I didn't think about it. See, because I didn't know anyone who was using a phone for this until I met someone and they said, no, I need to have a phone for this. And my yoga room had this sign, and the instructor was calling out people who had their phones on them, which would have been very embarrassing for them. So then they said, actually, I'm not going to go to this place anymore, because I don't want even have to have this kind of confrontation where in front of 40 people, I have to explain why I have to have, So it's just to avoid these kinds of situations. And maybe we can also segue into the conversation around disclosure with this. I think it's important to understand that we create accessibility measures to make spaces more welcoming. Some people will 100% be the kind of people we design these for. Some people will use them for other reasons. I guess it's not really our place to start, judging. Everyone's an adult, and everyone makes what their best choices for themselves. So yeah.
Thank you for raising that and for the example. And I think thinking of the role of the facilitator as being in full service of the group and trusting that they know what's best. It might be better to put the autonomy in their hands. And yes, there might be some who take advantage of the situation, but then on the other hand, maybe it's better for them to take advantage of the situation than to not show up at all.
Exactly.
And I think just to tell them that being pushed slightly out of the comfort zone is just part of the game. And then it's somehow our job to create the atmosphere where they feel safe enough to do that, although it feels uncomfortable. So to act against their preferences or comfort levels. Yeah. Thank you.
Okay. You did raise an important question about the whole thing around like disclosure, and to what extent how do we communicate about this without making people feel like they have to, come out and say, well, actually, I have this need, and so I need this and that. For this, I think there's one thing that first, the proactive measure would be to build these sessions that are designed to be quite accessible and inclusive to begin with. So already people who may have these needs are already covered just by the general design of the session. Then what you could still do, and this is what I encourage facilitators and event organizers to do, is to communicate proactively about, so like I mentioned, you can communicate about how the session will be, you can communicate about the kind of technology we will use. For example, we will have this session on Zoom, and at some point we will move on to Miro or Mural. You can even link to something called an accessibility conformance report. And I know both Miro and Mural have them because I've checked them out because I'm nerdy like that. And they both have tested their apps, their software, both in the browser and in the app version, if there is an app version. They've had it tested by disabled users, people with visual impairments, people who use, for example, their keyboard to control their screen. They've had it tested and they have rated it against a standard. So if somebody has an accessibility need and they're not sure if this new tool that they never heard of is going to be good for them, they can also check the conformance report. And then based on that, you could still have a little box when people register or an opportunity to reach out to you directly if this were on the Never Done Before community, for example, to say, hey, actually, it would be useful for me if I were able to have a link to the slides, like 5 minutes before the session starts so I can follow along. I won't save them, or maybe the link disappears after the session is over, just because I need to be able to have my computer read out the text to me, or I need to be able to enlarge it in a way that when you share the screen, it doesn't show up quite as crisp and as large as I need it. So people can reach out to you in the little box when they register or on the Never Done Before community and explain, hey, I would love to join the session, but since you will be sharing slides, would it be possible for me to get a link so that I could see the slides and follow along while you're presenting? And, I won't save them. Maybe you could deactivate the link once the session is over, but it allows me to use my computer to enlarge things that may not show up quite as large when you share the screen for us, for example. And so this could be an accessibility need that you fulfill. You don't need the person to say for what medical reason they do that. But once the person knows that there will be slides, it's a lot easier for them to make this request without having to divulge too much about what it is, why is it that they need it, and to make some very specific requests that are hopefully easy for you to fulfill and that allows you to make it like specific to what one person needs without, I don't think, affecting how the whole flow or how the whole session runs, just a little something extra that you do before to make it accessible for them. Because you wouldn't know necessarily that there is one person in the group who needs to be able to enlarge the text, right? You only know it if they ask you for it, or if you have offered to make it available to whoever requires it when you invite people to the session, right?
Yeah.
So,
and I can only imagine thinking back of the example with the phone, which is such a good example because you don't want to be the person who's looked at in this kind of shaming, blaming way. Oh, but you're not supposed to have your phone out there.
Mm-hmm.
And at the same time, you don't want to put anyone on the spot that they have to raise their hand and then slow down the entire group perceivedly because of their needs. So if I understand you correctly, the best way to, as a host, would actually be to ask in advance with the registration, please check any box if you have any of the 5 impairments or challenges. Or would you just ask, please let us know if you have any specific special needs that you want us to take care of?
I would go for the second one. I would say, please let us know if you have any access needs, based on what is being available, about the session. Because sometimes when you share the session, you don't even have like the agenda yet. And you may have like a vague idea about the kind of tools you're going to use. So I would invite people to share what kind of access needs they may have. So not necessarily disclose a particular condition or disclose like in which sort of like category of disability it's situated, but just, to share a specific access need, which is, for example, could you please make sure to turn on automated captions from the beginning, which on Zoom, the host has to enable for them to appear. I think on Teams, you can turn them on by yourself. WebEx, I forgot, but you have this option. It's free and it's there. And I mean, it's not too bad. Generally, it's like about 95% accurate. And every now and then there's like going to be a European name that it doesn't recognize. And it's going to give it like a funny, it's going to rename you something funny. but generally it's fairly accurate. And it's something that you would not necessarily know to turn on if you don't know that somebody has it. I would recommend that it's something that's nice to turn on by default and maybe even have it on Zoom in the settings that it's always like kind of like prompted at the beginning or something like this. But if you don't know to request it, then it's useful for the person to say, oh, hey, could you please make sure to turn on automated captions from the beginning? And then they don't have to explain why it is. You can potentially guess, but it could also be another reason. It could be that they don't speak English as a, first or even second language, and that they find it useful to have this little added bit of information underneath to better understand what people are saying.
And you can do this while the Zoom is already running, or do you have to do this in the back end beforehand?
I think on the back end, you have to make it possible for you to turn them on, and then it becomes an option where you can turn them on at the beginning of the session. But you if I'm not mistaken, you do have to initiate it. I cannot do it, for example, myself. But on Teams, I think you can.
Okay. Yeah. Very interesting. And also thank you for correcting me that instead of asking then participants to actually disclose their condition, I didn't even think about that. Just asking them, okay, what do you need? Also because this avoids me assuming specific needs. So that might not even be necessary. So I can imagine that someone who has a sight or a hearing impairment, they know how to deal with their conditions better than I do. So if I give them the option to be very explicit in their needs, then I don't have to find a workaround or to wrap my head around some technology that might not even be necessary.
Exactly. I think and the two examples I gave you, like, for example, sharing a link to the slides, even like just a PDF version, like a modifiable version. If you're ever sometimes people are worried about that content being extracted and used in other contexts. Some trainers are a bit like that as well. I've noticed you work with trainers, so maybe you know as well. But turning on the captions and sharing the link to like a PDF of an accessible PDF of the slides, those are they really only just take a few minutes so they're not even like massive, they don't cost you anything. They just take you a few minutes. If you know what you're doing, they just take a few seconds. And then the question is, it's fairly easy to do it, but you have to know that someone needs it. And this person knows exactly what's going to be convenient for them. So if they know the technology, they might well know what is helpful. What could happen is that they don't know the technology and they don't know what the technology can and cannot do. And then maybe you have to do a bit of work of researching and figuring out, okay, how do I do this? Can I do this? But generally the fixes can be, Googled and accessed fairly easily, hopefully.
Yeah. And I wonder, well, I interrupted you while you were going through the different groups.
Marianne, I could talk about this stuff for hours. I could talk about it until the cows come home, and then the next morning at dawn, I'm still talking. So please do interrupt me every now and then.
I'm very glad. I just didn't want to interrupt the flow, so I paused you to dive deeper into. And I think we started with the breakout rooms and whether someone feels confident or a preference versus a condition to join breakout rooms and to know more details about the agenda. And then moving to the next maybe groups of how can we accommodate those who are maybe visually impaired? Because, for instance, I have no idea how I feel so incompetent in this topic that I wouldn't even know how they can access a computer or be aware of my session in the first place. So if someone cannot see the program, how could they potentially sign up for my workshop and be there? So, and I think this might be the ignorance that hopefully not only I have, why we sometimes have a tendency to ignore that people with physical challenges might end up in our sessions. So how can we create this understanding of how someone with a disability can navigate the internet or digital tools in the first place?
I think that's a really good question. I was telling you earlier about a resource hub I'm creating about information about this. And there's a lot of really cool websites and also some like Chrome extensions that have been created to allow you to see, basically see things through the eyes of someone who has a glaucoma or someone who has this kind of color blindness or that kind of color blindness. Because there's not just one kind of color blindness, there's different kinds. Or to see what text looks like to a dyslexic person. So there's plenty of little tools that allow you to kind of experience it and sort of get a sense of, okay, so this is what it's like to have only a spot in the middle that's clear and everything around it is fuzzy or, something or the opposite. And to basically navigate the web. I even thought it might be funny, if you want, I can do this later, to show you what the Never Done Before website looks like to a colorblind person. You will be amazed. The color palette is very different, but I like it. I like the pink. You're thinking there's no pink on there. There is if you're colorblind. So there's different kind of tools like these. I think the key tips is that, first of all, most of the people, for example, with vision loss, will be people who have lost some vision, and maybe their perception of within, if it's not a good enough contrast or if the size is not big enough, then they can use their computer to use it kind of like as a magnifier or as sort of like to almost like color correct for how they perceive things. The computer can perceive a lot of the text if the document is made accessible. And I have also a whole module on how to make a document accessible, how to make sure that the pictures have an alternative text that describes what is in the picture so that it doesn't just show up as there's a picture and we don't know what's in it for the screen reader. And indeed, the screen reader. So the screen reader is essentially when you control your computer using keyboards on your keyboard shortcuts. And there's a million of them, Miriam. I try to use a screen reader, like just to get the experience of like what it's like to control my screen and hear what a blind person sees when they are navigating the web. But it's really not easy because there's plenty of shortcuts you have to know. But essentially, it allows you to read what is being written out there, to get an understanding of what the images contain. If you're in an app, you can see, okay, so we're in Zoom, it's recording. And then you can see all the little buttons at the bottom that you can interact with. These also become like a panel that you can interact with so that you yourself can post a message in the chat or, unmute yourself or do things like these. So you can perceive a lot of things using screen readers. Other people who use screen readers could also be people, I mentioned earlier, people who have tremor in their hand and do not use their mouse. It's not uncommon for people to also solely use their keyboard and just kind of like the keys at the bottom in order to navigate the internet. That's also because for some people, it's difficult to create a smooth, controlled movement with the hand. Whereas with this keyboard thing, you just move basically from option to option until you land at the thing you want to interact with, and then you interact with it. And so there's different ways to understand how people perceive sort of like the internet without necessarily seeing it or all of it. I'll share these resources because I think it helps build empathy and knowledge and understanding. Like we mentioned, a lot of it is, I don't think it's people don't care. It's just people don't necessarily know what it's like, right? And also what you can do, I think, as a facilitator or just generally as someone who collaborates with others who may have visual, impairment or vision loss, is to make your documents accessible by making sure, for example, use sans serif font instead of fonts with a lot of serif that can be confusing. Make sure to use the right contrast. There's tools that allow you to kind of scan websites for accessibility issues, and contrast is almost often at the top of the list. Creating the right kind of header so that people who use a screen reader can sort of skim the page by by chapter head instead of going through all the text. So basically having a hierarchy of content so that they can navigate it better. Yeah. So this is essentially what it would be like for someone to interact with your session. Most of the tools that we use, the Zoom, the Teams, the WebEx, these companies are investing a lot of energy and time and money on making their tools accessible, and they generally are very well rated. And so that's also why people who have screen readers tend to use these kind of these top three generally, because they perform very well. Yeah, that's essentially it.
I'm fascinated by what's possible these days technologically, and makes me aware that just because someone shows up doesn't mean that they don't have any issues or disabilities, that although they might not be visible. And still somehow I wonder, it is a trade-off because, so for instance, I love design. I love things to look nice. And I don't like to share slides. That's my own preference. And I wonder, to what extent is there a trade-off between making things accessible, or maybe even too accessible, and then at the cost of taking away some of the beauty and the little extra care or decoration that would make a difference for those who are not impaired? So where do you see the balance? Can we be too accessible that it then comes at the cost of the majority, or maybe doesn't even bring any benefit to anyone?
I understand the question because I often also ask myself when I design a session, when I design an event, like what's the equilibrium between, the kind of disabilities or accessibility needs that people may have versus what I can offer versus how many resources I have at my disposal. Because sometimes to make a session really accessible, it means that you need to have an extra person going in the chat and monitoring a number of things and so on. And you can't just like run it solo, for example. So it's not always an easy balance. The first thing, I think there is a myth around accessibility, that accessibility, it must be difficult, it must be costly, it must be ugly. Oftentimes, when something is accessible and ugly, it's because it was not designed to be accessible in the first place. And now they had to like build this ramp on the outside, or they had to build like an elevator. Have you ever seen those buildings? Like, you try to put an elevator on the outside because the building was never designed to be accessible in the first place. So retrofitting accessibility to session design or buildings that were never designed to be accessible can be a bit clunky. It can be
good
like
example.
Not great. But I mentioned Microsoft, Google. I should also mention Apple. These are companies that are investing a lot on accessibility and whose generally are well regarded as, kind of being at the forefront of pushing for accessibility in their products and in the way that their users use their products. And I don't think Apple and Google and these companies like that are exactly famous for designing ugly, UI unpleasant products. Yeah. So I think this idea of it, I don't think it's necessarily going to have to be ugly, but you do have to figure out what is the trade-off between the things that I can easily do at no cost and that are going to cover big ground versus what I have to maybe rely on the users to say, hey, this is what I need. What it could also happen is you don't want to share the slides. Okay. But just make sure that when you share the slides on the screen, and you just make sure that, for example, if you have a graph, describe what the graph is showing. Like describe, here you can see that we progress from this to that. Basically, what is the key message of the graph? You voice it out loud because not everybody can see the graph like you see it, for example. Or make sure that if there's an image in your presentation and the image is there to convey something, it's not just like purely decorative, but there is like a message or maybe, something to it. Just mention, and next to it, there's an image of a woman spreading her arms like this. You can make sure that your slides are accessible by just making this extra effort of verbalizing everything that is on it, including the visual elements that may not be visible to everyone.
Yeah.
So that could be maybe a compromise for you if you don't want to share a handout or the slide themselves.
The thing is, it's not that I don't want to share my slides, is that I don't do slides.
Yeah. No, I wasn't sure if that's what you meant by that. It's true. I don't think I've ever seen you use slides. I'm not suggesting you have to use slides, but some people, they like to have like a few slides or like maybe sometimes some people like to have a little bit. No, you don't have to share them. But if you have any kind of visual supporting material that you need to share screen, maybe what you want to make sure is that if you need to, for example, if you are using Mural or Miro and there are things happening on the board that people may not be able to perceive, that maybe you voiced it out loud if you're not sharing your screen. And if you are sharing your screen, make sure that you can zoom in and also describe what is happening just shortly so that people understand what is happening visually and can still get the gist of what the action is and not feel left out.
Yeah. And that's something that I've started after someone pointed it out, that all the instructions, or instead of having slides, I would put more stuff in the chat. And then I guess that these programs would read out the chat for the person.
Yes, they do. Yeah, the chat is actually even a better way. At least for this particular user group, it's even better to perceive information from I guess having access to the slides, having access to the chat, or having it read out. It's just like from most accessible to least accessible, but the chat is really good. That's another best practice I have for facilitators. And I think most facilitators in Never Done Before do this. Whenever essentially you want to provide information through different sensory channels. So if you voice out an instruction, especially before people leave out into a breakout room, you type something that you pre-prepared in the chat. it's going to stay with them in the breakout room. And also it's going to clear the confusion, when people go there, like, what we're supposed to do again? So haven't we all had that at some point in 2020 or something? And then it's a good idea also to use the chat to kind of like signpost what is happening. You can even use emojis. For example, if we use this swirl emoji, it's a technical instruction. If we use this star emoji, it's like signposting like a new section or something. I've seen some facilitators do this. Again, it requires for you to prepare your script and have all your prompts ready and then just like copy paste in a very organized fashion, or you can have your tech host do that for you. But presenting information in various sort of like sensory channels is really useful. I mentioned emojis. I realize that some people are not super fond of emojis and they think they're like a little bit immature or something. But there's text information and then there's emojis, which is like, or any kind of pictorial information can really be helpful in conveying like a tone, something extra to the text. And if you use emojis in some communications, there's like sometimes an emoji can really clear the tone of signpost, like this is like serious news, or this is like important news, or this is like more silly news. Using this is also very helpful for a number of people who find that they process information better when it is proposed in small, organized chunks, and even using like icons or emojis to kind of like signpost the kind of content it is.
I'm very glad that you're mentioning that, because I was about to highlight you as my role model. I think I saw you doing this the first time to use emojis in the chat when you were, I think you were summarizing something that I or a different facilitator did just as a participant, which was brilliant, just like the little angel who summarizes it for the rest of the group. And I realized that it's so much easier for the eye to capture quickly information in the chat when there's an emoji attached. So now what I started doing by default, whenever I put instructions in the chat now, every instruction starts with a separate emoji. Then you know exactly the order when starts a new instruction, and your brain can connect it to an image, which makes it better to memorize what actually has to be done. And on top of that, I also recently heard from someone that he was a highly visual thinker. And instead of words and bullets, he was thinking in images. So it's, again, a different way to process information. I assume that it's also on the neurodiversity scale. And then, it accommodates yet another group. So I'm all in for emojis in the chat.
Yeah, I think emojis, it's easy it's also possible to overdo them. But if you use them sparingly and you use them especially like consistently, for example, this kind of information always goes with this emoji, people start making this association. Also, I think they can find your text messages faster in the chat because they come kind of like all formatted in the same way, in a way, if you will.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Very good points. Hello, listener. Are you tired of listening to my podcast voice praising our sponsor Session Lab in each episode? I think it's time to pass the mic over to you. So if you are as much of a Session Lab fan and user as I am, please share your experience and praise, and don't be shy of add a sentence of self-promo. Send me your soundbite and you might hear yourself on the next show and find your name and URL in the show notes. I'm looking forward to hearing from you.